Hello, class. Today's lecture is going to be part two of the chapter three topic of solving problems. So in part one, we discussed, or I talked about solving problems analytically. And now in this lecture, we're going to talk about how to solve problems creatively. So there's the steps involved are the same. We still have kind of the same framework. We need to identify the problem, brainstorm solutions, evaluate and select a solution, and then ultimately implement and follow up. Those steps are still the same when we start talking about solving problems creatively, but now we're going to talk about kind of what hinders our creativity, and also some things that we can insert into that process, into those different steps, to potentially help us be more creative in how we define problems and how we actually solve them. So that's the kind of goal and purpose of this lecture, the part two lecture today. The impediments to creative problem solving really fall in what we call these creative blocks, or these conceptual blocks. We get so much information throughout a given day that we naturally create these blocks to help us filter out information that we don't need, to make room for information that we do need. And so these conceptual blocks really kind of prevent us from being more creative. The other thing that kind of prevents our creativity is thinking that creativity is one-dimensional, thinking that the only way to be creative is coming up with maybe something brand new, but there's lots of ways to be creative. And so this slide really just is there to represent kind of the different types of creativity. So I think it's very common to associate this idea of imagination and kind of new ideas as being what being creative is all about. But there's also, we see examples of being creative with this idea of improvement. So making small improvements to something that already exists is being creative, and tweaking things to make them more efficient or to make them better or whatever it might be is a form of creativity. There's a form of creativity with this idea of investment. Being very competitive, being first to market, the risks involved of doing that, or also this idea of incubation and being sustainable and really capitalizing on teamwork and empowering our employees, and the ideas and the creativity that comes from that diversity within a team and the ideas and perspectives that come from that. So there's different ways that we can be creative. So I keep this slide in here really to highlight that, to make sure that you realize that being creative is not just coming up with something brand new, but there are other ways to be creative within an organization. The other impediment is the conceptual blocks that I briefly mentioned. And so you can see the definition it's kind of these mental obstacles that really constrain us in our ability to define a problem. So the majority of the lecture is going to be talking about those conceptual blocks, and then also talking about ways to overcome those conceptual blocks. So kind of the first kind of step is recognizing that you have these conceptual blocks. For some of us, some blocks might be more prevalent than others, but just recognizing that we all have them, and being willing to work through them. There's two examples in the book that do a really good job of kind of highlighting some of these conceptual blocks, and looking at, what if this inventor wouldn't have been able to work through some of these conceptual blocks, right? We might not have the microwave, and we might not have the Post-it note, but these two examples are examples that we can definitely identify with. We're all familiar with the microwave. We all are familiar with the Post-it note. So it's just interesting to look at these examples, kind of the process of kind of how they came to be, and they provide some good examples of some of these conceptual blocks. So I encourage you to, if you kind of skim through those, to kind of go back, because it does provide some good kind of tangible example for you. The four conceptual blocks that I'll discuss today, you can see up here on the screen. Each block has two kind of examples that we'll look at. So you need to make sure that you can recognize not only the block, but the two examples that go with each block. Okay, so we're going to start off with the first block of constancy. And there's two examples of kind of how we fall into this particular block: the vertical thinkers and not having multiple thinking languages. So when we think of constancy and this idea of vertical thinking, sometimes our minds, we think of constancy as being a good thing. That's definitely a positive thing in most cases. But when we talk about being creative, it really hinders our creativity because we want that stability. We kind of think of this solution, or we identify this problem and we go with it. We're not able to think differently, right? We make that problem work. Where a lateral thinker is kind of a little more chaotic in their thought. They're kind of all over the place. They have this problem, they have that problem. They come up with this solution and then another solution that's, maybe way off base from what their original solution was, right? So they're all over. You see some descriptors there of being not stable, instability, looking for kind of these discovering kind of different ideas all over the place. I believe the book kind of looks at an example of, if I'm digging for oil, if I'm a vertical thinker, I'm going to kind of pick a spot and dig as deep as I can until I find oil. Where a lateral thinker is going to be digging all over the place. They're going to drill a hole here and then drill a hole over here, and they're just going to keep kind of searching in that way, right? So just a little different kind of approaches to things, but our lateral thinkers typically are more creative type of thinkers. So being willing to not be so systematic in our approach and being a little more disorganized, I guess, kind of leads us to more of a lateral type of thinker. The other one that falls under this conceptual block of constancy is not having multiple languages to kind of think in. And so when we talk about multiple thinking languages, we're looking at being able to think more than just in terms of words, right? So we can think of symbols and use our senses, and being kind of visual in our thinking. And there's some really great examples of being a multiple thinker, in our younger years in our education system. Our elementary teachers are very creative. They're good at coming up with different ways to help us remember things, right? And I don't know if as we get older, if we think we're too good for those things, and we don't do that as well, kind of as educators, as we kind of get older students, if we think that it's too childish. But if you think back to your elementary education, and you think about how you learned your multiples of 9, some of you might have learned them by, if you hold up, all 10 fingers, and if you're looking at your fingers and you say 9 times 3. So for me, it'd be this third finger, 9 times 3. So I put down my third finger and it's 27, right? And so that's just one way to kind of think differently on how to remember my multiples of 9, or how many days are in each month, right? So some of us might have been taught kind of the knuckle trick. So, if it lands on a knuckle, it's a certain amount of days. If it's in between the knuckle, it indicates something else. Using music or a tune to help us remember words, or a sentence to help us remember the order that the planets are in. All these different things are ways to think differently, right, to help us remember things. And so that's really this idea of multiple languages, being willing to kind of use more than just kind of words in our definitions of problems and in our solutions to how to solve those problems. The next conceptual block is commitment. So again, there's two kind of examples of this block: perceptual stereotyping and ignoring commonalities. Perceptual stereotyping is when individuals define present problems in terms of problems that they have faced in the past. So this seems like a very common thing to do, and it is, and in some cases, it's the efficient thing to do. However, when we're trying to be creative, we're trying to think of something different, something better potentially. Maybe how we've handled this problem in the past is not working anymore, right? And so just kind of relying on how we've done it in the past is not working. So we need to be more creative, where, you know, as we get a lot of experience, and I've dealt with these problems, these issues before, you know, that can help, right? It can help us be efficient. We can resolve these issues a lot faster. But again, when we're trying to be creative, this can be a big block for us. Or assuming that just because someone that has a lot of experience in a certain field or a certain area is the best person to solve this problem. All right, that's kind of this idea of perceptual stereotyping. Sometimes we need a fresh perspective, someone to think, you know, about this problem a little differently, or someone to come in and ask questions because they don't know a lot. And so that gets us thinking a little differently. All right, so the perceptual stereotyping, again, is maybe sometimes gets created because we've been in a position for too long, and this is how we've always done it. You know, and so it's hard to be creative when we're kind of stuck in that that past. The other one under this idea of commitment is ignoring commonalities. So creativity is blocked when individuals fail to find the common thread that exists between dissimilar problems. And so the microwave example that the book talks about is a great example of the inventor being able to connect kind of these two things that were happening that were very dissimilar, you know, being able to connect those two things and really created the microwave from that connection. But we actually have a solution for this particular block that we'll talk about here in the next couple minutes. But being willing to kind of think about, you know, how maybe some of these problems are similar, and maybe we can use a solution that I use for this problem on this problem over here, even though there's not kind of this obvious connection, maybe there is some similarity there. All right, and so being willing to kind of look for those similarities. The third conceptual block is compression, and so there's two examples of this idea of compression. So we have artificial constraints, and that's this kind of 9-dot problem, and we'll look at some of these examples in class. But what the 9-dot problem is trying to illustrate is, you know, the directions are, you know, without lifting up your pencil, draw 3 straight lines that connect all the dots, and it typically is seen as impossible. And what happens is students don't think that they can go outside that box. All right, they see that box as this limitation, this constraint, and that's what artificial constraints is really is. It's we make these assumptions, right? So we assume we can't go to the outside that box with our pencil, and because we assume that, we cannot solve that problem. All right, and so making sure that when we that our assumptions are accurate, that our assumptions are true, that we're willing to ask questions to make sure. But that's the idea, that we assume our boss wants it a particular way, or we assume our boss won't like this idea, so we don't present it, right? Those are all artificial constraints that prevent us sometimes from coming up with creative solutions or being able to even solve a particular problem. The other one is separating figure from ground. And that's what's trying to be illustrated kind of to the left here is kind of these 3D figures, right? So if you look at kind of the 3D kind of chaotic picture, are you able to kind of separate and pull out that object, that triangle or whatever that is that's trying to kind of pop out of there? And sometimes that's very difficult to do. And so if I can't separate, if I can't pull out the relevant information from all the opinions and the hearsay and all this kind of chaos, then it's going to be really hard for me to define the true problem. All right. And so again, if I can't make that separation, if I can't pull out that problem, that figure, then again, that really hinders our creativity and our ability to resolve kind of a messy looking problem. The last conceptual block is complacency. So again, two examples that go along with complacency. The first one is unwillingness to ask questions. So as we get older, for some reason, we don't ask a lot of questions. We're afraid of what our peers might think if we ask a question, and that might indicate that we're not as knowledgeable as them, because if I ask the question, that must mean I don't know the answer, and if everybody else knows the answer, and so instead I just don't ask the question. Creative individuals ask tons of questions. They don't care what their peers think. They don't care, if something fails or whatnot. They're willing to try these things and ask these questions, and that's a really great thing. So when we're trying to be creative, we have to be willing to ask the questions and to dig for more information in some of those situations. And then the other one here is the bias against thinking. Being creative is hard work. Coming up with different ideas or a new idea, something that maybe we haven't done in the past, takes a lot of work. And there's a lot of risk involved. And so because of that, sometimes we don't want to do that extra work, or we're not willing to take that risk. So we just go with what we've always done. All right. So again, if we're not willing to put in that mental work, then it can really hinder our creativity. So the next couple slides are going to look at ways to improve our creativity. The book breaks them up into kind of two different sections. So ways to improve our problem definition. And so as that first step in the problem solving model, how can I identify the problem better, more creatively? But you can also use these solutions later in the process as well, as you're trying to brainstorm more solutions. So again, there's not necessarily a right or wrong way to use them, but we just want to understand kind of what they are so we can apply them at different points in the process. So the first one is this idea of synetics. So make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. And this one is specifically trying to overcome the ignoring commonalities. That particular example that we looked at, it's trying to say, what if we look at this other problem that's not so connected, right? What did we do in that problem? What was that problem like? How did it feel? What was the results of that? What were some of the components of that problem? And is there anything there that potentially connects to this problem that I'm not so familiar with? Okay, and so the idea is that I make these connections. And again, we're gonna do an illustration in class, but just making sure you recognize that's what synetics is usually when I'm trying to resolve a problem that I'm trying to be or needing to be more creative with, it's because I'm not familiar with this. I've never had to deal with a problem like this, or maybe I've dealt with this problem before, but my solutions that I've always used aren't working. So now I need to be more creative. So I'm kind of stuck. All right. So synetics allows us to think, okay, what does this remind me of? What other problem that's not so obviously connected, what does that kind of remind me of? So you can go to a personal problem that you've had, all right, that's not work related, that has some similar kind of feelings or components to it, right, and bring some of that information back, some of those solutions that you tried, and it might help you think a little differently about the problem. That's the whole idea. It's not a guarantee. It doesn't mean I'm definitely going to come up with this creative solution, but it potentially is going to help us maybe think differently. All right, and that's the idea. How can get us to think different than what we've been thinking. Elaborate the definition is really just asking, instead of trying to say, what is the problem? Right, just trying to find that one problem definition. Talk about what are the problems, right, and kind of brainstorm. What are all the problems in this? And this is a great suggestion for the cases that you'll be doing, right? You're going to read these cases, and there's just going to be a lot of issues going on, right? So write those down. We have a problem here. We have a problem over here, right? And kind of get them all laid out there, and see if there's any common threads. See if there's any connections between any of those problems that can lead us kind of to this one underlying problem that's causing all these kind of symptoms. All right, but don't just get solely focused on that there's one right answer, because that's the frustrating part about being creative. There's a lot of times there's more than one right answer. All right, and we don't like that typically. We want to know that there's one answer that I'm looking for, but being creative means that there's a possibility of more than one right problem definition, and there's definitely a possibility to have more than one good solution. All right, and so being willing to expand your mind to kind of think in that plural and not just that kind of looking for that one right answer. Reverse the definition is just a little trickier maybe to apply. But again, the point of this is to just think differently. So reverse the definition will say, think in terms of opposites, kind of think in terms of being this problem being backwards. The book gives a good example of this parade example, and reversing kind of how we naturally think of a parade. We think of a parade as us as the spectators. We line the streets and the parade passes by us. And they were forced to kind of reverse that definition because of some circumstances in this particular example. And so they reversed the idea of what a parade is, where the parade stood still and the spectators walked along the parade route to see the marching band and to see the different floats, because they were really restricted with how to resolve a particular issue in that example. So if you don't remember that example, or if you kind of pass over it, I encourage you to go back, because that's a really good example of reversing the definition and coming up with kind of a creative solution. You might roll your eyes, right? But hey, it was something different and it worked for the scenario that they were kind of presented with. Ways to generate more alternatives, right? So as we move into the problem-solving process and we get into stage 2 or phase 2 of the process, and now we're coming up with solutions to our problem, right? Here are some options. Here are some solutions to get more creative in this step. So one is brainstorming, defer judgment. It kind of goes back to something that we already talked about when we were talking about solving the problem analytically. But brainstorming is making sure that we're encouraging creative ideas, encouraging quantity over quality at this time. We're not evaluating. We want kind of crazy, wacky ideas and building off of one another's ideas. All right, so with that, really encouraging that from all participants. So we really want to defer judgment. We want to defer that evaluation in hopes that we're encouraging kind of these crazy, wacky ideas, because it's those crazy, wacky ideas that typically maybe the original wacky idea is not the one that gets implemented, but maybe a version of that, right? Or maybe I say something totally off the wall, but it doesn't make any sense, but maybe it just spurs somebody else's thought, right? And so we want to encourage that type of brainstorming. Expand current alternatives. Again, that's similar to the definition, the earlier one that I was talking about, and not just thinking of one definition, but as you brainstorm and you're looking at all your alternatives, seeing if you can break those up, kind of expand those a little bit to see if we can come up with even more alternatives. During the brainstorming phase, it's always a good challenge. A lot of times we come up with ideas pretty fast, right? Everybody might come up with 2 or 3 ideas right off the bat, and then it's kind of silent, right? We can't think of any more. So push your group, push yourself to come up with, 2 or 3 more alternatives once the big rush of ideas are out there, right? That's usually where we get pretty creative in our options. The last one is combine unrelated attributes. And so there's a couple different techniques that the book talks about, this morphological synthesis and this relational algorithm that is on the next slide. And the morphological synthesis is really trying to break the problem down into their different components, into the different attributes of the problem. And, you come up with solutions for each of the different attributes and then kind of rearrange them to come up with, again, more solutions, more more combinations of what we can do to resolve the issue. The relational algorithm is, taking your problem definition and replacing the connecting words. So an example might be, the problem is that our customers are not satisfied with our service. All right, so the main parts, we have our customers and our service, and not satisfied is the connecting kind of phrase. What if I took that phrase out and replaced it with different connecting words? All right, so our customers before service, or our customers near our service, whatever it is, right, to complete that thought, that sentence. And again, does that create anything? Does that make me think differently about this problem? If I say our customers near our service, does it make, is a good solution to move our service center? Is our service center too remote? How can I get our service to be closer to our customers? Or, that type of thing. That's the purpose of any of these techniques, is just to get our brains thinking differently about this current problem. All right, and hopefully coming up with different solutions. Some just different tips to help us facilitate creative problem solving is give yourself time. It's not a quick process. Being creative is challenging, and it's not just going to happen in that meeting, right? You might have to kind of ponder it and think about it. So allow yourself that time to think. Allow yourself that time to not think about it. And sometimes those are when things pop in our heads, when we're not so kind of focused on it. Be willing to talk to other people. We get a lot of good ideas from just talking to other people, kind of telling them about the issue, and they'll talk about how they resolved it. And maybe that might work, or maybe that might, give you an idea, right? That's similar, but not exactly what they did, and so being willing to have these conversations. Reading a lot, right, gives you ideas and gives you different scenarios, and you just learn a lot through reading different articles, different books, whatever it might be. All right, and really, this last one, protect yourself from the idea killers. Those people that are pessimistic and they don't want to change, and so, oh, that won't work. Well, we're just going to do the same thing we've always done, type of thing. So really kind of be aware of who those people are, and kind of steer clear of them. So in this particular kind of chart or diagram here, you can see this idea. So when you're assessing the problem, if you think the outcomes are predictable, if you think you have all the information needed, that typically leads you to more of the analytical approach, right? But if you're looking at a problem and you're really not sure what the problem even is, there's just a lot of information missing, it might lead you to kind of force you to have to be more creative, right? And so that will lead you more towards this kind of creative side. And again, the diagrams is showing you some of those challenges that you might be faced with, regardless of the route that you're kind of needing or forced to take, and then some of the suggestions of how to work through that particular process. This last slide, in terms of kind of the content, is looking at different ways to foster creativity in others, right? So we can think of these conceptual blocks and try to do some things for ourselves to help us be more creative. But if I'm, leading a team and I'm needing my team to be more creative, here are some a few things that we can do. So pull people apart, put people together is really just referencing, either changing groups up, or pulling people apart, letting them do some independent thinking, coming up with their own ideas of what they think the problem is, what they think are some solutions, and then putting people together to discuss and to expand on some of those ideas that they've already had. Pulling people apart and putting them in different groups, right? Again, to get different perspectives, to get fresh perspectives and different connections that way. Monitoring and prodding is an important part of fostering creativity. Making sure that the team's staying on track. Giving them good questions to think about, to kind of steer them away from maybe something that we've always done, right? To encourage them to think a little differently, but also monitoring to make sure that they are working towards a solution. being creative is really messy, and we could be creative all day long, right? And all year long, trying to, continue to be creative. But at some point, we have to have a deadline. We have to kind of make a decision and move into a solution and an action plan. And so making sure that they are still kind of staying somewhat structured and kind of a messy process. Then the last one is reward multiple roles. So as you're encouraging individuals to be creative, make sure that you're not just rewarding the one that came up with the good idea, like the creative idea, but was there anyone that helped support the idea? Was there a sponsor that helped get the idea up and running? Was there people that also took a risk to get on board with this idea? There's a lot of different roles that have to be played for an idea to go from an idea on paper to actually being implemented. And so if those roles are being played to move this creative solution along, we want to make sure that we're willing to reward those roles as well. Because if we're only willing to reward the role of the person that came up with the creative idea, then everybody just wants to be the one that comes up with the idea. No one's willing to support it or sponsor other ideas, right? And so really making sure that you're fostering an environment that supports and encourages these other roles to be played. All right, so the last couple slides are just some questions that, again, I'll read. You can press pause to see, to come up with the answer before I reveal it, but I won't really give a lot of time on screen for you to kind of think through that. Your boss states, conceptual blocks are easy to overcome. Also, everyone develops some conceptual blocks over time, and we need some to cope with everyday life. Should you agree or disagree with your boss? The answer is you should disagree. So even though everyone does develop some conceptual blocks over time, and we do need them to cope with all this information that we get in our everyday lives, they are not easy to overcome. So we really have to put forth a lot of effort and being aware of our conceptual blocks so we can put some things in place to help us overcome them in order to be more creative. When an individual becomes consistent in how he or she approaches problems, he or she is practicing which conceptual block? Right? So when an individual becomes consistent, that is kind of a key word in this particular problem. So the answer to this one is B, constancy. Right? So that was the first block that we talked about, that kind of vertical thinker. I come up with this idea, or I come up with this problem, and I really try to make it work, and I'm not willing to kind of think of different options out there. All right, so that's that idea of constancy. If you assume that individuals who are experienced in launching a new product know the best marketing approach, which conceptual block are you practicing? And the answer to this one is C, this perceptual stereotyping. All right, so we're assuming that just because their past experience, they have that past experience of launching a new product, that they're going to be the best kind of moving forward. And so that's that idea of perceptual stereotyping, looking to what worked in the past to work currently or in our future. One of the most common blocks to creativity involves a person becoming so committed to a particular point of view that they fail to identify themes that link the problem to other related areas of knowledge. Which of the following describes this phenomenon? So when you look at these options, ideally on a test, these are kind of example test questions that you would see, of the four, which ones are actual blocks? Right, so kind of crossing any out that aren't a block to even be considered. So synetics, B, and C, morphological synthesis, are kind of techniques to overcome these blocks. Right, so for this example, you can really just cross those out right away because they're looking for one of the most common blocks to creativity, not a particular technique to overcome a block. So of the two that we have left, we're looking that the one that fails to identify themes, and that's the idea of ignoring commonalities, right? And seeing these connections to that. Synetics, B, is really a technique that helps us overcome this particular block. And again, we'll look at that more in class with an example that we'll do. I believe this is the last one. If you have trouble determining the difference between important and unimportant data, you are experiencing which conceptual block? Right? A, ignoring commonalities. B, artificial constraints. C, separating figure from ground. Or D, non-inquisitiveness. Right? So the answer here is C, separating figure from ground. So again, that's that 3D picture. If you're having a hard time separating important information from all the chaos, that's that idea of separating figure from ground. And that's the example that fell under that idea of compression of the conceptual block. All right, so if you have any questions, obviously let me know. But again, in class, we'll look at some examples and we'll really try to apply some of these techniques to overcome some of these blocks that more than likely we all have. All right, I'll see you guys later.